Okay, this will be the video summary for Chapter 8 in Consumer Behavior. Looking at Chapter 8, we are now going to start looking at the internal influencers, those things within us that impact our buying decision making. And you'll notice that there's a unit page right before Chapter 8 begins that shows you the consumer behavior model and where the internal influencers fit in. Chapter 8, Perception, is what we'll be looking at here. I want to draw your attention to Figure 8.1 on page 272. This is the information processing. Notice that there are 4 stages to information processing. The first 3 stages, which are exposure, attention, and interpretation, we refer to those as perceptual processing. That's the perceptual process. When we add memory to it, that last stage, it changes the perceptual process to information processing. So Chapter 8 is dealing with the first 3 steps of that Figure 8.1, which is the perceptual process. Then Chapter 9 deals with memory, which adds one more stage to it, which changes it to information processing. So the perceptual process is the first 3 steps of information processing. Starts with exposure. Really not a lot here, except the exposure is when we come within range of a stimulus, when our sensory nerves, remember we have 5 senses, when one of our senses comes within range of a stimulus, then we say exposure has occurred. If we go down the highway and we pass by a billboard, exposure has occurred. Now we could be looking at the other side of the road, but the billboard, we didn't see it, but the billboard, we still had exposure to it because it did come within range of our eyes. So exposure only needs to occur. Exposure occurs when the stimulus comes within range of the sensory nerves. If you'll take a look at the voluntary and involuntary exposure there, another name for voluntary exposure is deliberate exposure, and another name for involuntary exposure is random exposure. Once exposure occurs, the next stage is attention. There's quite a bit of stimulus out there that we're exposed to, but of that we're exposed to, only a smaller portion of that we pay attention to. The definition of attention is when that sensory nerve is stimulated. When that stimulus activates that sensory nerve, then attention has occurred. And there's some information there on attention. We can change things with the stimulus or different characteristics there of it. The person that is going through the perceptual process, their individual characteristics impact whether they pay attention or not, those kinds of things. The third and final stage of the perceptual process involves interpretation. This is where we are exposed. The stimulus came within range. Attention, even fewer stimuli gets to our attention, which it activates our sensory nerve. And then even less of the stimuli do we interpret. And interpretation simply means that activated sensory nerve sends a message to the brain for processing. Again, there are some things there that you might want to take a look at as far as interpretation is concerned. Individual characteristics, the situation, the stimulus itself. There are 2 terms on page 292 that I want you to be familiar with. Sensory discrimination, which simply means that some people can hear things better than others, taste things better than others. They have a more discriminate sense, like more discriminate hearing or taste or whatever. So we have to remember that as marketing managers, that some will interpret things better than others. And then another term on page 292 is an acronym called JND, which stands for Just Noticeable Difference. And marketers use this. For example, if you take candy bars that were manufactured in the 1970s and compare them to candy bars made today, you'll see that the candy bars from the 1970s, the regular size candy bar, was much larger than the regular size candy bar of today. The industry has gradually made the candy bars smaller, but each year they reduce the amount of candy bars so little it stays below our just noticeable difference, our J&D. We don't really see a difference between last year's candy bar and this year's candy bar because it was such a slight change. But if we compare several years ago to this year, we'll see a difference. But they make the changes in such small increments that we don't notice a difference. They want to stay below that just noticeable difference threshold. To finish out Chapter 8, looking at some things about the consumer that might influence the perceptual process, things like the quality of the signal, like we use surrogates to determine quality, because it's kind of hard to judge quality looking at it in the store. So in the U.S., a lot of times we'll just say, hey, the higher the price, the better the quality. So we use price as a surrogate for quality. And then finishing out the chapter in the last Roman numeral of the outline, looking at how retail uses perceptions and marketing strategies. Companies want to be careful not to have information overload. They have so much out there that the messages aren't being interpreted because it's difficult to pay attention to everything. But there are times when say a retailer wants to get not only exposure, but get us to pay attention and interpret the stimulus. For example, when they put things in the midway aisle at a retail store, like Walmart puts things down the main aisle, it gives the perception that it's on sale and it's a good deal, when actually those things down the midway are good margin items for them, and they just want to increase the exposure, the attention, interpretation there by the consumer. So that's Chapter 8. Wanted to hit some of the highlights there. We'll move on to some more internal influencers with chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. And with chapter 9, it will continue this idea of perception and add one more stage to it, memory, which takes us from the perceptual process to information processing.